Could you hear me?
Yes.
We can hear you.
Could you hear me? Okay.
Hopefully,
And could you see me?
Yes.
now we can see you as well.
Amazing.
Okay. Finally, I could manage. Okay, great. Thank you very much again. Sorry for this small problems, technical problems. So, dear colleagues, let's start the today meeting. Welcome to this webinar dedicated to the recent developments in Belarus. Few of you may know that Belarus became an associate member of the NATO PA in 1992, but was suspended in 1997. This followed the rigged constitutional referendum of 1996, which marked Mr. Lukashenko's decisive turn towards authoritarianism. This was totally incompatible with the values the alliance and the assembly represent: the democracy, the rule of law, and the human rights. Since 1997, the assembly has maintained occasional contact with representatives of the Belarusian civil society and opposition figures, and regularly monitored developments in Belarus. Indeed, even if our assembly no longer has any institutional link with Belarus, we cannot ignore the situation in that country today. Peaceful protests are met by growing repressions and arrests, including of leaders of the protest movement. Colleagues, let me be clear. This is the struggle of the Belarusian people. No one can fight it for them, and no one should interfere with their struggle. I believe that an open national dialogue is the way forward to fulfill the democratic aspirations of the Belarusian citizens. Belarus is a sovereign and independent nation, but the international community can and must find ways of ensuring that the violence stops and that the people of Belarus can choose their leaders and political future freely. I had a chance to talk about these issues with the NATO Secretary General, Mr. Stoltenberg, and we agreed that these are the proper point of views that we should share among our colleagues and assembly. I issued also a presidential statement on 19th of August where I condemned the violence and I called on Minsk to fully respect its international commitments and fundamental rights, including freedom of expression and the right to peaceful assembly. Moreover, I also arranged a telephone conversation with several leaders of our assembly some weeks ago, and in these conversations we agreed how we will follow the communication guidelines that Mr. Stoltenberg set for us in the past weeks in his statements. Mr. Stoltenberg has stated on several occasions that NATO does not pose a threat to Belarus and has no military buildup in the region. He has also stressed that the NATO is a defensive alliance, which must always remain vigilant and stand ready to protect and defend the citizens of the alliance. And now we have today, at the today meeting, we have two excellent speakers, friends and colleagues, and they are very much experts on this issue. It's my privilege to introduce to you first Franak Viachorka, if I'm pronouncing right your name. He's an excellent, well-known Belarusian journalist and non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Franak is a frequent commentator on political processes in Belarus and an advocate for democracy in his country. For his activism and journalist work, he was jailed multiple times by the Belarus authorities. He graduated from American University in Washington, D.C. and the Warsaw University. So welcome here. Thank you very much for your presence and your time. And we are waiting very much for your words about the situation. And if I may, I would like to introduce the second speaker. He's also with us now. And I'm sure many of you will know our second speaker, Professor Mark Galeotti, is one of the most prominent British experts on Russia and on post-Soviet space, and he shared his views several times with our members of the assembly. So the whole meeting will follow will follow like that. You will have two lectures. You can say whatever you want. You can share your views and insights about the situation. And after the two lectures, there will be a possibility for a Q&A session for our members who are engaged in this session. So first of all, I would like to ask Franak to start his presentation. So I would like to give the floor first for Franak, and then for you, Mark, you will be the second speaker. And after the two lectures, we will go on with the Q&A session. Thank you very much again for your time and your presence. And Franak, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thanks everyone who organized this event. I'm very pleased to be here and very great to talk at this important moment for Belarus history. I would say that the situation is not just complex, it's extraordinary, and it's very difficult to compare Belarus situation right now to any other similar cases and any other similar, in theory, similar revolutions. It's not Armenian case, it's not Ukrainian case, it's definitely not Hong Kong protests. It's something very unique. And the best comparison I found so far is comparison to 1989-1990, when Belarusians were fighting for independence from Soviet Union. Because there is the same tiredness of the regime, people want changes, there is disappointment of the ideology, the social contract is not followed by the state, and there are constant protests attended by multiple social demographic groups. Besides internal Belarus uprising, which is happening right now every day, for 36 days in a row since the election day on August 9, there is another important issue, the independence of Belarus and the possible threat from Russia. So Russia was always trying to keep Belarus on its orbit. Lukashenko was always playing the geopolitical seesaw between the West and Russia. Sometimes we joke that in winter he is pro-Russian, in summer he is pro-Western or opposite. But ideologically, he is much closer to Russia, to Putin, to Kremlin, than to the West. And right now, he's pretty explicit about this. And I think he understands very well Putin, how he works. And I think in this critical moment, he behaves actually very honestly. He really believes that Russia must help and must save him from these brutal, peaceful protesters. What's happening right now on the ground? So we have the active protest mass. It is more than 700,000 people. It means about 10% of active adult population of Belarus. Most of protesters are in Minsk, but also big cities are participating. It's not just the West, but it's the whole republic, the whole country. And people are gathering at the streets with a very simple demand. They ask Lukashenko to resign. They don't talk much about ideology right now, so it's true when some people say that it's not the geopolitical issue, but it's internal Belarus political issue and fight for democracy. But it's getting more and more geopolitical because of Putin primarily. Russia makes this revolution, this uprising, very geopolitical. Russia wants badly the West to participate, to interfere, because it will justify the bigger, the spread, the development, the deployment of Russian forces in Belarus. The same thing on the violent side. Authorities are trying to make this protest violent. They're trying to provoke protesters for using or protecting themselves. And we see right now situation very close to August 9, August 12, when the most brutal crackdown did happen, when thousands were arrested, when hundreds were beaten and reportedly tortured. What to expect right now? So we can expect the ongoing protests, the further development of this protest movement. Perhaps it will not be just about the street, it will be also about workers. 3 weeks ago, workers were trying to organize the nationwide strike. Now they are trying this week to start it again. Authorities on their side, they are trying to behead all movements, all initiatives. So major leaders of the opposition, major leaders of the strikers movements, and including the Coordination Council created by Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the candidate who reportedly won these elections. So they are trying to eliminate any possibility of institutional presence of the opposition on the ground. So when the workers are trying to organize in strikers' committees, authorities extremely quickly, they isolate or detain or arrest or pushed out of the country these people. This pushing out of the country, that's another form of the human rights violation, which is actively used right now in Belarus. First, it started with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, who was given two choices, bad and very bad, and we don't know for sure what she was told, but she fled Belarus for Lithuania the day after elections. And now they canceled the passport, the Belarus passport for the leader of Belarus Catholic Church, the Belarusian priest Tadeusz Kondrusevich. Today was announced that his passport is not valid. So what they do, they push active, visible, important stakeholders from Belarus, and they don't let them back. So if Svetlana Tikhanovskaya will be willing to come back to Belarus, it's not excluded she will be her passport will be not valid anymore, and she will not be let in. This brings us to the situation when Belarus becomes the kind of Abkhazia. You know, Abkhazia. So it's a republic which is not recognized by the world, by the major powers. At the same time, it has its own puppet regime, its own puppet government. It has its own budget, but in a direct dependence of the Russia. And I think this is a scenario which Russia tries to develop in Belarus right now. And the constitutional reform offered by Lukashenko, like a few days ago, I guess, this is the part of the Russian scenario, but not Lukashenko's scenario. And I think Lukashenko agrees on this constitutional reform plan because he doesn't have choice. I think this is the condition of Putin's support of Lukashenko. And definitely there is no sign that Lukashenko is going to have any dialogue with Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. It doesn't seem that Lukashenko is ready to leave his position. There is no any sign Lukashenko is ready to conduct elections right now. So this brings us to the deadlock situation when protests are not declining, are not fading away, and authorities are pretty confident in their power vertical. What can happen next? The economical crisis. And if economical crisis will get visible, stronger, like I think in 1 month, when people will not be paying taxes or paying for their apartments for several days, Belarus economy will suffer significantly, and Lukashenko will face another wave of protest, of resistance. What I mean, the rate that the Belarus ruble can fall down. The state companies will not be paying salaries to workers. Some major production will stop. People will be sent to mandatory leaves, etc., etc. And all this can lead to the second wave of the uprising. And the second wave, it can create a critical situation to the regime, which will, the first wave created the crack, but the second wave will be able to collapse it. So, and I personally, I don't believe that the situation will get to normality pre-election. I don't believe Lukashenko will be able somehow to stabilize situation without Russian help. So either Belarus uprising is winning and Lukashenko is ousted, or Russia just take control over Belarus territory and create Abkhazia or Chechnya, in case if Lukashenko will be given unlimited power as he gave to Kadyrov. That's it on my side for presentation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I'm here. So now I would like to give the floor to Mark, please. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here. And more specifically, actually, particularly honoured to be able to share a virtual platform with Franak as a representative of one of the extraordinarily brave and effective journalists who really have been allowing us to actually get a sense of what's been going on once foreign journalists either got expelled or just simply found themselves being cycled through and then cycled out, as is the way of these things. And I want to start by looking, obviously, I'll be looking primarily at the, as it were, the external picture of Belarus, which to a large extent, unfortunately, means the Russian sense of Belarus. But I want to start by picking up and agreeing very much with something that he said, which was that this is not Ukraine. This is not the Belarusian Maidan rising. But I would say that I think Moscow has pretty much guaranteed that there will be a Belarus Maidan. I have no idea when it will be. It could be in a month or in a year or whatever. But a popular rising that is explicitly about Belarus's geopolitical orientation, not just its domestic politics, is now, I would suggest, pretty much inevitable, precisely because of the intervention of Russia. And it's an interesting, and this is a whole wider issue that I won't go into in any detail, but it's interesting as a symptom of the way that actually we've seen, certainly in the last year, Russian policy become increasingly clumsy and heavy-handed. They have taken a country whose people, to a large extent, regarded the Russians as their brethren, if not always with hugest affection, but nonetheless with that sense of sort of close ties. And I think increasingly, we're already seeing it now, but increasingly we will see an anti-Russian dimension to the protests. And that reflects the fact that obviously Lukashenko has made a choice. With the gratuitous falsification of the election results in which he sort of awarded himself a thoroughly unrealistic 80%, he lost his last shreds of any degree of popular legitimacy. And as a result, he is now sitting on a throne of bayonets. It is all about force. And as a result, he will face continued challenges. And again, what it really means is exactly whenever there is an economic crisis, a political crisis or whatever, it will once again raise this whole question of what is the basis for the power of this regime. And in that sense, he obviously had to, as he is now, at this very moment, he's currently in talks with Putin in Sochi, barter autonomy for support. And that support can take many forms. It can be, and it is already, political. It's in terms of media agency. It's in terms of economic support, not necessarily military. Or rather, that certainly is not what Moscow would want. And I'll come to that in a moment, because we really have to emphasize the extent to which Russia is a deeply unenthusiastic patron of Lukashenko's. They have no particular liking for him, precisely because for so long, and this is why he kind of always acquired there was this notion that he was a sort of singularly wily operator, exactly because he was constantly trying to play off Russia against the West and the West against Russia, which you can do up to a point, but it's not going to make you any friends. And this is the situation now. And it's quite interesting that when Lukashenko arrived in Sochi, the head of state, and who was he met with? He was met by the local mayor. Not exactly the kind of reception you would get. And even if one looks at the Russian press this morning, it obviously was well aware of what was going on, but it was very much presented exactly as Lukashenko, the man who outsmarted himself, coming cap in hand to Russia for assistance. They're not sparing his blushes. They're not going to make any kind of pretense about the situation. And they've already made their demands. I mean, it's highly likely, for example, that the replacement of the existing head of the KGB, Vakulchik, with his previous deputy, Tertel, was part of Moscow's price, because Vakulchik was seen as someone who had very much spearheaded the attempt to make sure that Russian proxies were kept out of the Belarusian security apparatus, and had also been behind the pre-election gambit of arresting 33 Russian mercenaries and claiming that actually it was Moscow, evil Moscow, that was interfering in Belarusian politics. Instead now, as it is, it's the evil West. Tertel, on the other hand, career KGB officer, but nonetheless also someone who is regarded, at least in Moscow, as being much more a man they can do business with, much more a man whom they feel is, again, not a proxy, but closer to them. So I think what we're already beginning to see is Russia making it absolutely clear that it is willing to support Belarus. Correction, quite the opposite, actually. It is willing to support Lukashenko against Belarus, but there will be a definite price. And part of that may well be, in fact, a sense that he has to accept that there will be a transition to another leader who is acceptable to them by a process, a pseudo-democratic process. I would not honestly expect that that will be successful, but I can see that as being the kind of sort of game plan that the Russians are trying to think, realizing that Lukashenko's brand has become, fatally tainted. So they have no desire to support him, but they feel they have to. And to understand why, one really needs to wander into the paranoid conspiracy theories that sadly dominate the senior policy elite at the moment, or at least the ones whom Putin listens to, as a shrinking circle. And these are the people who basically regard Russia as being in an existential political struggle with a West that is trying to deny them their rightful place as a great power. And their notion is that obviously a great power has to have a sphere of influence. And as far as they were concerned, as far as they're concerned, Ukraine ought to be part of their sphere of influence, Georgia, and naturally Belarus. So although they don't really want to be supporting Lukashenko, they have convinced themselves, with Lukashenko's very, very active support, that it is a choice between that or ultimately, as they would see it, losing Belarus. Again, the irony is they've guaranteed that in the long term they will lose Belarus by doing this. A direct military option is very, very much their next to worst option. Only if they felt that absolutely that basically the regime would fall and a new regime would arise which would reorient Belarus in a more west-looking direction, would they actually seek to deploy military force. But nonetheless, it's also worth stressing that that force is there. Putin has mentioned that he's created a reserve of law enforcement officers. Now, that is probably code for a task force of the National Guard, which may well technically be a law enforcement force, but is essentially an alternative army, a paramilitary force with its own tanks and such like. And beyond that, it will be relatively easy for the Russians to project force into Belarus. And the interesting thing is we'd probably get a scenario that actually would be a little bit like the ill-fated Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, in which they sent in troops ostensibly at the request of the current head of state, but in practice actually also to topple that individual and put in someone whom they think would be more tractable and more popular. Now, obviously, Belarus is not Afghanistan. I'm not for a minute suggesting that we have a similar trajectory. But nonetheless, this arrogant assumption that they could deploy force, that would overnight overawe the opposition, and that they can just get to choose a new leader, that sadly, I think, is not beyond the realms of possibility within the current sort of Putin circle thinking. So the question becomes, what can be done about this? And I imagine this is something that we'll be addressing in the sort of discussion, so I won't go into too much detail. But I think an important point to stress is, in a way, Russia has escalation dominance, if we're going to use military framing for this. Belarus matters to Putin. This is a man who, after all, is reigning with one eye on his historical legacy. And to be the man who loses one of the Slavic brother nations is bad enough. To be the Tsar who loses both, I don't think that is acceptable from his point of view. So the Russians can, and if need be, will escalate, whether it's in terms of money, throwing in money to try and stabilize the economy, which was already something that we're actually seeing sort of some moves towards, or whether it's actually throwing in force. All of those are available. And so if we are going to go beyond just simply symbolic declarations of our views and hand-wringing and, also some support for civil society, as countries such as Poland already have pledged, we really need to be absolutely sure that we're going to go through with it. Because for me, in some ways, I think the worst scenario would be if the West, if Europe, if NATO talk big, with the risk that will then, we know, to the paranoid old men in the Kremlin, be seen as proof that in fact the West is trying to steal Belarus from Russia and take it into its sphere of influence. That's how they will twist any major statements about this. But if we talk big and act small, all we will actually do is empower those people who feel that this is a geopolitical contest and that therefore they have to crush any independence-minded and democracy-minded sentiments in Belarus in the name of that geopolitical message. That's my sort of quick snapshot of the situation. And again, I'll end it there because I think it's more interesting to move into discussion.
Hello, thank you very much. I'm asking that do we have any questions already? Yeah, Andreas?
Yes, Mr. President, we again, I would like to encourage the delegates who want to take the floor to press the request to speak button. In the meantime, I actually can see already one name, Mr. Michal Szczerba from Poland.
May I ask first one question, because Mark just said a quite interesting catchword for me at least, that talk big, act small, if I'm summarize rightly. What is your opinion, feeling that what does the European Union do now? Do they follow this you just said, that too much speak or too much talk and no action? Or how do you see the current situation and the past few weeks and months in this regard, as you just portrayed this situation? That would be my first question, if I would like to take the floor, and then now I will ask Andreas to give the floor to our colleague who would like to ask a question, and then of course Franak and Mark would answer the two questions together. Yes, please.
Okay, so Mr. Szczerba from Poland, I will activate your. Sorry. Yes, you should be coming up on screen now. Please, Mr. Szczerba.
Hello. Hello, everybody. Thank you for this great opportunity to listen to our distinguished guests. Maybe you don't know, but I was the only member of parliament who was present during the election day, and I was also in Minsk the following nights. So I'm a kind of observer of the actions of the events in Belarus, and of course I accept the statement of our president and the statement of the Secretary General of NATO, but we have to know that the people of Belarus, they are fighting for the same values we as Euro and Atlantic community have. This is the democratic and free elections. This is the situation when the people's will is respected. So I would like to ask our guests to comment on today's talks, Lukashenko and Mr. Putin. What could be the main message of them? We also would like to. I would like to also ask our president about some steps we can propose to support the people of Belarus. Is it possible that we can prepare a draft of the resolution on situation in Belarus for the next session of our NATO PA? And I would like to also report to you that last week Svetlana Tikhanovskaya was in Warsaw. She met with our prime minister, where she met with the opposition to the government. So she was given a lot of support from peoples of Poland, and we need also to be to support her in our countries, and there shouldn't be any talks about Belarus, their future, its future without her, because I'm I'm absolutely sure that she won the first round. She should be treated. I know that it's legally very difficult, but she should be treated as a leader of the Belarusian society now. Thank you.
The answers. Yeah.
No, it's just
Yes.
we just wanted to let you know, sir, that we have 3 more questions at this stage. But since there were quite a few questions already, perhaps we could ask our 2 speakers to respond to the first round of questions.
Yeah, please, yes, do. The floor is yours, Mark and Frane.
Mark, do you want to start or I? Okay, so the first question from Mr. President about European Union, what can be done. Right now, there are multiple tracks of support of Belarus. First of all, the resolution that was adopted by Lithuanians has a very important meaning for Belarusians. This resolution says that Lukashenko is illegitimate leader, and accordingly, all the deals made by Lukashenko with Putin or whoever else do not have force. So we don't know what is the legal implementation of this resolution yet, but I think the adoption of such resolution on the parliamentary level of different European countries must be very, very helpful. And this resolution also said that Tikhanovskaya is elected leader of Belarus people, not the president, but leader, which also empowers a lot the Belarusian democratic force. And I think Tikhanovskaya is the leader of the whole protesters right now, and it's the first time in Belarus history when all democratic pro-democracy forces in Belarus are unified around one person, which makes the task for the Western democracies much easier than before, because we shouldn't look who is more powerful and who has real impact on the society. And more than that, Tikhanovskaya finally established the control over the street protests. So the first weeks, they were more or less chaotic, but now it seems there is the clear, direct connection between the groups organizing the protests and Tikhanovskaya herself, and all the groups organizing the protests support her. What can be done as well? Besides parliamentary resolutions declaring the legitimacy of Lukashenko, it's very important European Parliament to adopt the resolution on condemning the situation and the crackdown on Wednesday, I guess. So there are several projects. I think one is prepared by EPP, by other parties. It's very important, these resolutions, they will not be just about condemning, but also about clear action. Clear actions can include the list of individual sanctions. And it's very important to not just sanction the small group of people surrounding Lukashenko, but all the siloviki who participated in the crackdown. And such list exists. We have to make sure that any violence, police violence, brutal detention, fact of torture will not be unpunished. And unfortunately, right now, there is no way to do it in Belarus. What we really see, they're really afraid of being sanctioned. The project Black Book of Belarus appeared online, which identify the people on this police side, plain clothes, beating people, and they cover their faces with masks because they're afraid of being identified. And I think this is the really simple for the EU to do, and for the Western democracies to do, and which can have real impact on the Belarus situation. Besides that, it's very important to clearly send a signal that the West doesn't interfere, definitely. But on the other hand, the West is ready to provide package of economic help, something like mentioned Marshall Plan or something like. It's also important on the message level, to show Belarusians that even if your economy collapses, there are friends and partners who will help you, who will invest in the future Belarus, and you will be compensated. Your companies, your businesses will be able to thrive without Lukashenko even more. Also, we have to think about corridors. Let's prepare for the worst case scenario. If Lukashenko will begin shooting people and and more injured and more wounded people to come to happen. Humanitarian corridors. Right now, many Belarusians cannot come to Lithuania or Poland because of COVID. They're stuck. Many of them are detained. I tried to count it yesterday. 110 friends of myself, including journalists, are in jail right now. Many of them face multi-year prison terms. And many of them did not manage to leave Belarus on time because of the visa limitations, because of all this stuff. I think, the lifting visas can be very simple step as well. And provide humanitarian corridor, including for those who will be not just persecuted, but wounded, injured, medical help. That's also what can be done by NATO lines somehow, or specific programs, tracks. Answering the second question. The second question was, thank you so much to Mr. Szczerba. I think Mr. Szczerba showed by his personal example that it's very important to be on the ground. And I think he did give very good signal also to Belarusians, because he managed to meet Belarusians, but also to special rapporteur of Anais Marin, right? Michal perhaps can correct me if I'm wrong. And definitely he managed to show to Belarusians that the Europe is solidarizing, but also he managed to tell Belarusian story to Europeans, because unfortunately there is a very little information in Europe about what's really going on place. I think besides several Twitter accounts and few media outlets, not much information on European media right now, 4 weeks after the crackdown happened. Ambassadors of European states did play important role twice. First, when they came to the place where the first protester was killed, they came to put flowers to Taraikovsky, the first guy who was killed by police. And second, they came to protect Svetlana Alexievich. And it seems nobody used it against Belarus protest. And the opposite, this gave fantastic effect. Belarusians felt protected, supported, facing the Russian threat, Lukashenko's violence. There are so many diplomats of the Western world who are saying, we will not let your Nobel laureate to be detained. And it works. And I think diplomats, Romanian diplomats in the country, they can do more proactive. They can march with the people. There is nothing bad in this. If they will join one of the solidarity or any other marches happening in Belarus. And in general, supporting regular people, sending very simple messages to those oppressed right now, that the Western world, the free world is with you. Messaging is same important as promises of economic support. Lukashenko got promised today $1.5 billion from Putin. It's a stabilization loan or something like this. Putin said that this money you will receive for in this tough time of your history. This money is not enough to stabilize economy right now, but I think this was the main goal of Lukashenko to go to Russia. He wanted to get some financial guarantees from Putin. It will give him some more time, and he hopes that the protest will fade out. In case it will give him another 6-8 weeks, I would say. If the protest will not fade out, then he will need either another loan or he will be in trouble. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mark?
Well, it's always very difficult to follow Franak because he sort of covered the ground so extensively, and essentially pretty much everything he said I would agree with. So let me just sort of pick up on a few little sort of pieces. First of all, if I can take things in the opposite order, Mr. Sherba's question, again about the Putin-Lukashenko meeting. We'll have to wait and see about all the details that comes out. But this was never going to be about some kind of instant make or break, here's an agreement on sort of full unification of the Union state, just sign here or anything like that. In part, this is actually about, again, as I said before, demonstrating the power relationship. It's about getting Lukashenko to come and visit Putin in Sochi, again, the site of, as Putin regards it, one of his triumphs. Very much about taking this man who for so many years has been such an irritating, frankly, pain in the backside as far as the Russians were concerned, and actually trying to more or less emphasize this point about, well, we have broken you. You are now entirely dependent on us. And this is something that they will continue to maintain, I would suggest, a drip feed of support. They won't just simply say, here is a sort of, okay, they promised a large amount of money now, but they're not going to, as it were, lay out all their support here and now, because they're going to try and essentially invest the minimum possible. And secondly, they are going to continue to be wary of Lukashenko. They want to keep him on as short a leash as possible. And therefore, in some ways, we can expect this to be just the start of a process, not because I think that we're going to be seeing regular meetings between Lukashenko and Putin, but in terms of the interaction between Russia. In a way, this is something that starts now rather than ends now. And that actually raises some interesting questions about precisely what can the West, what can the European Union do? And I said, Frank's coming up with a wide range of things. I think the key thing, in a way, first of all, the key and brutally rude question that has to be asked is, how important is Belarus to the European Union? Now, I would personally hope that it's very important. And clearly certain countries, particularly neighbouring countries, have demonstrated their own commitment to Belarus. The problem is that there are other countries which may well regard this as, yes, very unfortunate, yes, something that they need to say the right things and pass the right resolutions, but not really something they care about. And I think that would be a severe problem, because, again, looking at how the Russians are already beginning to frame this and how they're beginning to explore it, they are hoping that they can find enough evidence that there are countries that don't truly care about Belarus to allow them to tell themselves that they can ignore the words because they don't believe deeds will be coming along there. Now, the Russians often miscalculate. The Russians don't, frankly, understand democratic societies, and therefore they often get their calculations wrong. But that still doesn't stop them trying. So first thing is, absolutely, from the word go, there has to be a high level of coordination in the messaging. The more it looks as if, well, there are some countries that care and some countries that don't, and some kind of lowest common denominator policy will emerge from that, the more reassuring that looks to Moscow, the more they feel that there's going to be relatively limited cost internationally from supporting Lukashenko. And I think this is a key point. On whom does Lukashenko depend now? He depends on the Russians and on his own security apparatus. And that's pretty much it. So in some ways, if we're talking about a really pragmatic and practical policy, it's actually trying to address both of those issues. Now, as regards the Russians, I think one thing, it does have to be made clear to them in due course, and it doesn't have to be done publicly, because again, the Russians have a tendency to bristle when they're sort of attacked or sort of remonstrated with publicly. But nonetheless, it does have to be made clear that there will be costs to supporting Lukashenko, especially if exactly this starts coming to bloodshed. And that those costs could include sanctions and so forth. But also, the more that Russia actually commits itself to stabilizing the Belarusian economy, the interesting point is actually the more vulnerable that makes the Russians. Because it means that actually sanctions upon Belarus, sanctions that have a meaningful impact on its economy, also become secondary sanctions on Russia, if Russia has to step in to basically cover the shortfall. So I think, and that's something that it's worth actually, again, not on the record, but nonetheless absolutely communicating to Russia that you will effectively, at a time when frankly you want to be mustering your resources for all kinds of other purposes, but you will be bled by this. So costs. And also, I think there's only a limited value to individual sanctions on Russian officials these days. But nonetheless, they have more than just a symbolic impact. And I think we also should be adding to our sanctions list anyone who we identify as actually having any kind of contact, supportive contact, whether it's going in meetings, especially if it's then providing training or whatever, for members of the Belarusian security forces. There is a lot of back and forth cooperation that takes place, and we can expect it to become even more so. Well, everyone who gets involved in that, there should be a price. There goes any hope of a holiday in Europe or whatever. And when we're talking about that, let's move to the security forces, because again, a crucial element is going to be about, can one do anything to help split away the security forces, most of whom are not feral animals. However, horrific the activities, particularly of the Amon riot police that we've seen on the streets. I mean, it's actually noteworthy is that we had, cases of individual police officers, publicly, bravely, repudiating that kind of violence, and a clear evidence by certain sort of groups in the security forces that they don't really want to get involved. Now, the leaders of the security apparatus, they are Lukashenko's people, and anyway, what would any kind of post-Lukashenko future look like for them? It would mean trials for human rights abuses and so forth. But there is a huge stratum of other people within the security apparatus who at this stage actually are still, I would say, reachable. And I think, therefore, that there ought to be a mix of, first of all, signalling, saying, look, things are going to come. I mean, even if it just give people a month and say, well, look, come October, if you're still in the ranks come October, you can bear in mind that you will not be getting a visa, for example, for Europe, and nor will your family. We can't really work, unfortunately, on the black book that Frank mentioned, simply because once one starts getting into, well, this person yes and this person no, it becomes open to legal challenge. But if one just simply says, look, if you are or were during this time a police officer in Belarus, and you were still in the ranks at the beginning of October, well, I'm sorry, you're not welcome. Things like that, which one can do, and they're both symbolic as well as practical. And the point is, what they actually do is they signal to people that in a way a wider world is watching and a wider world is judging. And at the same time, there ought to be some kind of signalling to say that actually for people who leave, there will be a degree of clemency, that it is acceptable. Again, you don't want to push people into a corner. Because I find myself wondering, in terms of thinking of parallels, and yes, every country, every situation is its own case. But nonetheless, I'm thinking back to the August coup that took place in the Soviet Union in 1991. Where the defense minister and the interior minister and the head of the KGB and all these other officials, basically thought that their institutions could be carried with them, just simply because they decided to back conservatism and trying to block, interestingly enough, a new union treaty, and that every police officer, every soldier, every KGB agent would never necessarily follow them, and they didn't. When push came to shove, most of them either refused to or just simply tried to keep out of it. The very first day, for example, of the August coup, there was a record level of illnesses amongst the police, quote unquote, because everyone just wanted to wait and see. So we shouldn't assume that just because the people at the top of the system are Lukashenko's men, and frankly have nowhere else to go, that the same is going to be true of the apparatus. And so we should do everything from practical measures to signalling to basically say, look, this is your chance to be on the side of the good guys. And more to the point, if you do choose to stay on the side of the bad guys, there will be costs to you. Final point I would want to make in terms of quite how the European Union can respond. And I'm a great believer that, unfortunately, authoritarian regimes have come to predict how democracies tend to respond. And in some ways game plan out and come to accept the sort of cost of doing business, the usual sanctions and so forth and diplomatic language. They kind of more or less think, well, we can deal with that. We need to be imaginative. Think of things that actually would have a genuine impact. And for example, I mean, it's a very humane measure to say, we will have, corridors whereby Belarusians can escape. A deeply practical way of both effectively, inflicting costs on Belarus and also helping Europe is to look at this thriving IT sector. takes place, that is in Minsk, and say, look, if you're a Belarusian IT worker, come on over. We will give you expedited, leave to remain, or even residence. Not only do we get a bunch of smart programmers, but we also start kicking out part of the economic support base of the current regime. Now, yes, in due course, there has to be precisely a way of rebuilding that economy. And even if it's that we tell these people, look, you can stay if you want, or we'll give you 25,000 euros to move back to Minsk, or whatever. I mean, other people can work out the policy, but I think we need to be imaginative in how we try to come up with responses, because we must accept that this, for Lukashenko, this is his last battle. He's not going to be reasonable. He is going to be thoroughly unreasonable because this is it. And therefore, we need to find ways of still making costs that can still meaningful for him.
Thank you very much. Andres, who is the next
Sure,
colleague?
Mr. President. Again, I would like to remind the delegates that if they wish to ask for the floor, they should click request to speak button. At the moment, we have actually we had three delegates who wanted to ask questions. Now only one is remaining. Perhaps they will come, the other two colleagues will come back. In the meantime, if I may, we also have one question that came from a member of the European Parliament, Rasa Yuknevich, who's also former president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly. If you don't mind, she unfortunately couldn't read it, couldn't use take the floor herself. So she wrote it in the comment section. If you don't mind, I will quickly read it.
Of course, of course.
Sure. So she's saying this: Belarusians today are leaders of an important new phase. The second stage of liberation in Eastern Europe is taking place. The first was the collapse of the USSR. Both the Belarusian nation and the civil society are being born before our eyes. And brave Belarusian women have taken an important role of this uneasy democratization process. Impressive and important. I wish you the best of luck, because you are an example to the Russian people and others. My question is about the topicality of today. Putin apparently sided with dictator Lukashenko, not with a fighting nation. Obviously, territory is more important to him than a friendly, free nation. How do Belarusians view this? What do you think Putin's plan is, if any? What do Belarusians expect from the EU? How could we help? Well, that's the end of the question. Clearly, some of the questions have already been asked about the role of the EU, but there are some other elements, such as the role of women in the uprising, as well as the example to the Russian people that the Belarusians are giving. And with that, if I may, I would then suggest to give the floor to, so we have another delegate, our Latvian colleague, the head of the chairman of the Economics Committee, Ivans Klementievs, would like to have the floor.
Yeah, Ivans, please. The floor is yours.
It usually takes a few minutes, so... Mr. President, I think we have some problem with Mr. Klementiev's connection.
Yes, then...
in that case, we also have another participant who would like to ask the floor. It's Gražvydas Jasutis. He represents the Geneva Center for Democratic Control of Armed Forces.
Yes, please. Of course. The floor is yours.
Okay, good afternoon, colleagues. And thank you. Thank you for the invitation. And I'm indeed very delighted to be a part of our partners event. So it's really good and great presentation provided by Mr. Franak and Mark. So I appreciate that indeed. And I follow the situation from capital of peace, Geneva. And I'd like to ask the speakers about the security sector in Belarus. Well, it seems to me that Belarusian security sector still remains loyal to Lukashenko. We saw several defections who resigned in opposition to the actions of the security forces. So do you see any potential for more defections and support the protesters, which might change the nature of protests But if the protests are not supported by the security sector, don't you think that the regime remains supported by at least some part of the society, and this dialogue is badly needed? Thank you.
Yes, and now could we find Ivans or not, Andrius?
Mr. President, no, he's not back, so perhaps we could take those two
Lost in
questions.
space. Okay, and now I would like to ask the two speakers to answer the two questions you just shared with us, Andrius, and of course the current question. Please. Now, shall we start with Mark, just to change the course, and then secondly, Franak. Mark, please.
Okay, thank you very much. Let me just pick up on 2 points. I mean, first of all, from the first set of questions, about Putin and about the Russian people. I mean, what we have to realize is that Putin's notion of power is in many ways, as I said, a very 19th century one. Issues like soft power, economic dynamism, all that kind of stuff, that for him doesn't really matter. I mean, a sphere of influence is precisely countries that must accept that their sovereignty is subordinated to yours. And I think he has a very, in that respect, unnuanced picture of what power really means. And that, I think, is the crucial point for him. It's not, I'm not getting a sense at the moment that certainly the Kremlin is directly worried that people power will move from Belarus to Russia. Obviously, if there was a success tomorrow, if all of a sudden Lukashenko did fall, security forces, massive defections or whatever, that would be sort of distinctly alarming. But I think at the moment, in some ways, their biggest concern is immediately geopolitical and political social in the long term. You know, exactly. If Belarus is lost, then Russia looks weak. And their notion is, and again, I mean, in some ways, this sounds like I'm caricaturing, but I really do feel from my conversations with people who kind of channel the inner Kremlin elite, this is the way they do see the world. A weak country is a vulnerable country. That ultimately it's a brutal world in which if you cannot demonstrate that you can at least even control, you know, even a little country like Belarus, well then if you lose that, then what's going to happen next? So I think there is that sense that this is a sort of a crucial political struggle. But in terms of the impact this could have on Russians, I think this is always, I think, one of the misunderstandings about Ukraine. There's a sense of, oh, well, they hate what's going on in Ukraine because if a regime falls, then, you know, it gives a certain lesson, a message to ordinary Russians. Well, I don't think that's the case. I think one area that Putin has been really quite successful in is in persuading Russians that revolutions are bad things, that revolutions are dangerous. They actually create more trouble and greater immiseration. Instead, the real danger for Russia would be a Belarus that is not just democratic, but democratic and successful. Ukraine is, after all, represented as democratic and failing, and is actually presented as an object lesson. You don't want Russia to be like Ukraine. Now, of course, this is not actually how Ukraine is, but that doesn't matter. I mean, this is about politics, which is, I'm sure I don't need to tell everyone, not always about objective reality. Well, likewise, actually, I think because Russians, in general terms, Russians actually always regarded the Ukrainians as their kind of fiery brethren, and the Belarusians as the sober, get things done ones. And I think actually a democratic Belarus that is also successful, I think that would be a really corrosive problem for the Kremlin. But I said that's years away. Even if Lukashenko falls tomorrow, it will take time to demonstrate that a democratic Belarus works. And I think that Putin and co, they are thinking in really quite short-termist moves. To move on to the second point about the security sector and defections. Yes, I mean, we had individual defections. It takes a lot to get someone to defect from a disciplined service, especially when you suspect that there's not going to be change quickly. You know, if it looks as if the regime is crumbling, that's the point when all the cynics and the pragmatists also suddenly discover that they were Democrats all along. But anyway, we're not talking about that. At the moment, we're talking about people who are really willing to make a stand. And I think, you know, at the moment, it's unlikely that we're going to see mass defections because to a large extent, it is the Amon who are being used for the most brutal acts. For me, the interesting wild card is going to be the armed forces, who up to now have not been involved, very specifically not been involved. I mean, even when you see what look like troops, they're actually interior ministry troops rather than the armed forces. And although there has been, the Belarusian armed forces train alongside their Russian counterparts and to do a lot of exercises, and in many ways are structured in such a way that they can almost be considered to be an arm of the Russian armed forces. That's not how Belarusian military think of themselves. And I think actually the issue of quite where they would stand if we really started seeing blood on the streets, that is, and I have absolutely no answer. I mean, maybe Franak would actually be able to sort of speak to this more. I have absolutely no answer, but I think that's the whole point. No one has an answer to that. That could be one of the absolutely determining factors when they decide that, in fact, their mission of defending Belarus does not actually mean defending Lukashenko against the people of Belarus. And a lot of the efforts has got into actually building a real esprit de corps within the Belarusian military. And there has been quite a bit of success in that, particularly ironically in the elite units, paratroopers and so forth. Very much rests on this notion of them as defenders of the motherland, rather than them as stormtroopers of a regime. So there's an interesting potential fragmentation point there.
Thank you. Franak?
Yes. I fully agree with Professor Galeotti, and I feel like we are on the same on the same wave, and we understand each other very well. I just wanted to add about the Siloviki and about law enforcement. So you know how this power vertical of Lukashenko is built for himself, by himself and for himself. And it's almost impossible just to take out Lukashenko from this power vertical, and it will continue functioning. Unfortunately, it's not like this. People can work in any system. Most of the people are technocrats. Not speaking about Siloviki, not speaking about KGB officers, but all these officials, doing their ministerial jobs, state committee jobs, etc., etc. And the problem is that in order to make them switch the side, they must understand that the current power vertical is not functioning anymore. And also they need very clear deadline. They need clear deadline, clear procedure, how they can side with protesters. And why we don't see much defections, because they basically don't know how to support the protesters. Should it be the post on Facebook? Should they call Tikhanovskaya and say, I support you? Should they do as Pavel Latushka to join National Coordination Council? The Coordination Council didn't give them clarity of the process. If this process will become more or less established, we will see much more defections, not just from officials, from the official non-military power vertical, but also military part and police, etc., etc. The second thing, the deadline. Right now, yesterday, Tikhanovskaya announced the deadline for Siloviki. It's October 9. October 9 because it's 2 months after elections. This is the day, the last day when inauguration of the new president must happen. And if Siloviki doesn't decide on which side they are, after this day, they will be guilty. So this is the message that was sent. And I think that had to be made much earlier, not 1 month after the elections. But right now we will see more and more people defecting. I saw the instant effect yesterday when the Telegram channel Belarus of the Brain promised to publish the names of the police department employees, and Belarus of the Brain channel received 70 messages in a few hours sending the report that they are quitting their jobs. And they say, don't publish our names because we are quitting our jobs. So, they need incentive. And this incentive was created yesterday. The deadline is October 9. For Siloviki of the highest level, for these generals, and also for the management and the commanders of OMON, that's much tougher, because it's not just about switching the sides, it's about some kind of betrayal. they are, when they take the oath, when they come to the service, they give the oath to president. And from them, it's much more difficult to expect the defection, because for them it will be like they betrayed their oath. I am very sad to say that, but I don't see any possible chance that OMON, and there are 1,500 of the soldiers of OMON in Minsk, I don't see any chance they will switch the sides. They will be following, I think, the Berkut path. You remember Berkut in Ukraine fighting the protesters? So I think we can expect something similar like it happened in Ukraine with OMON in Belarus. They will be fighting to the last drop of blood, as they promised to Lukashenko. Regarding women and the Soviet, the continuation of the Soviet resistance, and thanks to Rasa for her support, for many years support of Belarus. This is definitely a big deal, and women are very, very active. And I must say women are much more brave than men sometimes at the protests. What happened last weekend, police began treating women same as men. They also beat them, they also arrest them. And I realized that there was the order given from the very top, from Lukashenko's administration, to not give any concessions, any concessions to female protesters. So we can expect that women marches and women protests can be cracked down as the large protests on Sundays.
Thank you very much. And now we have two last questions, one from Andrius and the other one from Ivans, because he wrote down his question on the message board. So Andrius, if you can, read what Ivans just asked, that would be nice. And then please add your question, and all together our colleagues can answer the two questions, and then we can close the today meeting. Andrius, the floor is yours, please.
Of course, Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Indeed, Mr. Klementev's had some technical problems, so he wrote down a question which goes like this. The question is about what can do for democracy European Council. I'm not sure if Mr. Klementev's meant the EU's European Council or the Council of Europe, perhaps. Maybe we need to send a European delegation to Minsk, because during the Maidan in Kiev, Lukashenko showed that dialogue is important and organized two meetings in Minsk. So that's the question from Mr. Klementevs. If you permit me, I would like to ask a very quick question. Currently, if you listen to the Russian-speaking media or follow the Russian-speaking media, there are two major issues. One is Belarus, another one is Navalny poisoning. So I wonder, obviously, it's difficult to say if there's any direct or indirect connection between the two, but at least Mr. Lukashenko has certainly made that connection by presenting a leaked conversation between Minsk and Warsaw. So I wondered if you could maybe say a few words if indeed there could be some implications of the poisoning of Navalny vis-a-vis Russia's approach towards Belarus. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Franak, would you be so kind to start, and then Mark. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks again for the question. So what can be done on the European Council level? First of all, to meet Svetlana Tikhanovskaya. You know, I was repeating many times and on my publications and on Twitter that even the meeting with Tikhanovskaya matters a lot, because even if you don't say that she is president-elect, it's very important to show the support, the solidarity, and the recognition her as the representative of Belarus people. I think very important for Mr. Borrell to meet Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and for European leaders. That's not about the European Council only, but I think, you know, if Macron, and I think it is planned already, if Macron and Merkel will meet Tikhanovskaya, it will give her very, very strong, not the power, but yeah, somehow power, also to inspire Belarus protesters. Because, Belarus protesters, they also think that Lithuania is good, they support us, Poland is also good, they support us, but still big powers are silent. And I think this is what majority of Belarusians think. They think if not Russia, then we need someone on our side, someone big. And these big ones, they're silent so far. And European Commission. Regarding other international organizations, I think monitoring missions of Parliamentary Assembly, of Council of Europe, could be very good solution. There were discussions with Netherlands about this, but I think this is must do as soon as possible. Monitoring mission that comes, document the violence, document human rights crimes, meeting people, more international organizations present on the ground, a lesser chance that violence will be continued. I don't say that it will prevent violence at all, but it can help. When Western diplomats were attending mass rallies in '96, in 2000, 2001, I remember, I was a very young boy back then, but I remember when diplomats were present, Lukashenko never cracked down on these protests. So sometimes it works as the protection. And monitoring mission, it's not just protection, but it also help to legalize to use these documents
Excuse me, Franek, we seem to be losing you. We have lost the last minute. What you said in the last minute, the connection is not great. Perhaps we could actually turn off your camera. Sometimes that helps if the connection is not good. We don't want to overload the connection. So if we just... Okay, so Franek will probably try to reconnect. In the meantime, Professor Galeotti, perhaps you could try to take those two questions.
Surely. First of all, in terms of dialogue is one of these things that we talk about a lot, and obviously it's very important, but it requires both sides to be willing to actually talk. And I think the problem is at the moment that Lukashenko seems to sort of demonstrate no signs of a willingness to talk to the people he needs to talk to, in other words, his own people. Now, that doesn't mean to say it's entirely hopeless. I'm just saying that I think at the moment, unless he's given a good reason to, which is, again, where the outside world may be able to come in, we can't expect any kind of meaningful dialogue. And I think the thing is, he has demonstrated that he seems to regard that as a weakness. And therefore, that creates a problem. But obviously, that does not, for a moment, mean that there's nothing that can be done from the outside. Franek came up with a whole bunch of excellent suggestions, and particularly in terms of how we talk to Tikhanovskaya. Because one of the key things is this: look, authoritarian regimes thrive on hopelessness. They thrive on giving people a sense that it's not worth challenging the status quo, because all you'll get is trouble, and no one else cares about you, no one has your back, and so forth. So I think it is important to be able to demonstrate purely in even if it's just in symbolic terms, that actually we do care, that we are indeed aligned with the Belarusian people, that we are watching, and put people on the ground to demonstrate that. And here I think the use of monitoring missions and so forth as a way of trying to kind of restrain the excesses of violence is indeed worth following through. And in some ways it's a little parallel almost with the whole notion of NATO's enhanced forward presence in the Baltic states, which is there not just simply to provide additional force to potentially deter an attack. It's actually different types of people on the ground, because we know, and it's not right, but nonetheless we know that from the Russians' point of view, the danger of killing an American or a German or a Brit is regarded as much more serious than if the danger is killing an Estonian or a Latvian or a Lithuanian. Again, I really wouldn't want in any way to be trying to say that that's okay. But but we have effectively been able to use that and give force to the whole NATO guarantee. Well, likewise, actually, by having people on the ground. So that the thought is, if you did really start to escalate the amount of violence that you're deploying, there is a risk that one of the skulls you crack will be from someone, from someone, whether it's a parliamentarian or an official or a volunteer or whatever, from a European mission. That might be a deterrent factor. It's worth certainly sort of exploring. And we also ought not to forget, when we're talking about Tikhanovskaya, also the case of Maria Kolesnikova, who is now in prison after showing extraordinary bravery, sort of bravery I certainly couldn't imagine having, to at the last minute rip up her passport to stop her from being expelled into Ukraine, and she's now in prison. When we focus on Tikhanovskaya as the putative elected president, we shouldn't forget the other opposition leaders. We shouldn't make it look as if in a way we are just simply trying to push an alternative candidate into power. We need to demonstrate that we support the opposition generally, not just one individual. And Andreas, in terms of your question, I mean, although I don't think, as I say, that the Kremlin is at the moment panicking about Belarus example suddenly coming out into the streets of Moscow, I think that there is a connection. I mean, I must admit, when Navalny was first poisoned, I thought it was unlikely that the Kremlin had actually ordered that killing, because it was an attempted killing. There's no way you can try and titrate dose nerve agent to just hurt the person. No. However, with the news from the Germans that actually this appears to have been a particularly advanced form of Novichok, slower acting but more deadly, that makes it all the less likely that it came from one of the other grandees of the system, and all the more likely that it was the Kremlin. And I think we can explain that by a whole selection of reasons why suddenly these days the Kremlin is suddenly getting nervous, and why an opposition figure who had considerable leeway for years, because he understood the rules. He would go after the Prime Minister Medvedev, but he wouldn't go after Putin, that kind of thing. He always showed a very keen awareness of where the red lines were and how to keep just on the right side of it. And I think that a combination of Belarus, the protests that we're seeing in Khabarovsk in the Russian Far East, the fact that they had to rig the constitutional vote, and then this past weekend's local elections so blatantly, and let's not forget that obviously it was a blatant vote rigging that triggered the whole Belarus crisis. And Navalny is championing the so-called smart voting, tactical voting against the United Russia Party. I think all those may well have contributed to that red line shifting. Navalny not being aware of it, and his position that was once safe, well, he hasn't moved, but the red line moved, and he suddenly became fair game. So that's my current sort of working hypothesis. So Belarus is one of the factors that just simply contributes to, as I said, a rather kind of paranoid conspiratorial Kremlin suddenly thinking that in fact things are getting too dangerous and it's time to basically be more ruthless.
Thank you very much. And I think we have one more questions. So if we can add to this meeting is, if I'm right, Ahmed. Ahmed Yildiz. If he's here with us, then Andreas, please give the floor to Ahmed.
Please, Mr. Yildiz. And we also have our second speaker, Mr. Vechorka, back.
Perfect.
Yes. Am I on? Mr. President, Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you well.
Yes, of course.
Greetings from Ankara. Following the comments and answers by the speakers, I felt obliged to inform the colleagues, this August body, because I am also chairperson of the Turkish delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Last week, we discussed this issue both in the political and legal committees, and we hosted Madam Sivanovskaya, Mrs. Sivanovskaya. We listened to her. As you know, Russians are also there. It is a very bigger organization. The number of delegations are big. And many delegations expressed that we should keep also the door. We should insist on dialogue between government and opposition. And also we should insist on sending a fact-finding mission, provided that Belarusian authorities allow that this mission, this delegation, can freely meet everybody, can see everywhere to determine the facts. Yes, tomorrow we will talk about this issue also standing committee, in the standing committee of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Then I wanted to inform you about this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And now with your answers, we will close the meeting of today. So please, Franak, start with you again, and then perhaps Mark will close the meeting with his answer. Yes, please.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I missed perhaps a round of questions, but I can make some closing remarks if it's okay. So again, situation is developing quickly. We know that Putin wants to use this moment for himself. There is the way to not to stop him from doing this, but at least to increase costs of incorporating Belarus. We don't speak about invasion, so we can't speak here about Donbass or Crimea scenario. We speak here about long-term incorporation of Belarus. So it's more and more close situation to, let's say, Crimea, but without soldiers, Abkhazia, but without also military actions. So he has already his strong ally in Belarus. This ally is super weak, super dependent, and relies only on financial, political, and diplomatic support of Putin. And Russia understands it very well. So Lukashenko receives this financial support, and it's not. And in exchange, I think Putin will be pushing this idea of constitutional reform. We have to follow it closely, because we don't really know what changes are proposed. They are speaking right now about the change of presidential powers. They speak about the new role of parliaments, but it is not initiative that can be negotiated with the opposition. This is not initiative that Belarusian democratic forces right now are fighting for. Let's do all possible right now to stop, to prevent escalation, because we are very close to the moment when Belarus can be back in the situation of August 9, August 12, when the biggest, the most violent crackdown happened. So, and to stop, to prevent it, we have to be allowed. As journalists, I'm trying to arise and to cover this topic so much as possible. But on political side, it's very important not just to condemn, but to take very quick steps in supporting civil society and media on one hand, and to put pressure and all his cronies on the other hand. Thank you.
Thank you. And now, Mark.
Yes, it's very hard to know what to say after that, because obviously I think, France sort of covered the points. I mean, I do believe if we're talking about dialogue and so forth, these are obviously tremendously important, and fact-finding missions likewise. But in all cases, it's because what they provide is the capacity to bring engagement into Belarus, and engagement at a meaningful level, which basically means at the street level, at the opposition level, and so forth. And in that respect, actually, we ought to be trying to think of as many different ways in which we can engage as possible, not just simply, say, parliament to parliament. But is there scope, for example, for trade union delegations to go and talk to the workers in the factories that precisely have been looking to see how they can actually organise, even though many of the trade unions are still really instruments of the state, without in any way providing any additional legitimacy for the regime. There can be many different ways in which actually we demonstrate that we care about Belarus. And again, that's, on one level, it's a phenomenally banal point to make, but I think it is a really important one, because in a way, Lukashenko is banking on being able to reverse the momentum that has swung against him. Reverse it on the street so that after a certain point, yeah, fine, people can protest, and sometimes, you know, the Amon are unleashed and sometimes they're not. But the hope is that after a certain point, if they can't get anywhere, people just think, well, what's the point? You know, I can be doing something else with my Sunday or whatever. But also the political momentum internationally. It's that, you know, today Belarus is the story of the moment, and, you know, there are discussions like this and delegations and things. But if things begin to just sort of drag on and another crisis emerges somewhere else, that again, the news cycle gets dominated by that. So, you know, in many cases, Lukashenko is playing for time. And therefore, what we need to be doing is moving quite fast to ensure that we begin to create all kinds of interconnections and don't allow him to basically run out the clock. And the final point I'd make is, I mean, it's worth noting that, you know, Lukashenko may well be, for example, not very impressed with the idea of fact-finding missions or any of these other things. Although it's not something that I would necessarily advocate, I think it's something that's worth perhaps hinting as a sort of political nuclear option, which is actually formally recognizing a government in exile. Which would have to be more than just simply Tikhanovskaya, and, you know, transferring, you know, giving that certain rights and powers and such like. As I say, I think at this point the trouble is then that kind of locks everything down. But just as a way of making it clear to Lukashenko that, you know, things could get a lot more serious for him, a lot more negative, and in effect that would basically delegitimize all the institutions of the current Belarusian state. That is the sort of thing which we ought to be kind of publicly trailing, even if actually it's not something that we really wouldn't necessarily want to use.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It was a real excellent presentation and Q&A session. I think we are very much more familiar now with the situation in Belarus. I'm quite sure that this was not the end, but the beginning of this process. So I'm quite sure that we will have much more opportunities and events when we can talk about these issues. There was one specific question from my Polish colleague. He said that we should somehow or think about to write a resolution or something like that about this situation. Thank you very much for your idea. Now I have the impression that what Mark said, too much talk and much less action is not good. So I would like to keep a little bit my finger crossed and talk less. So I would like to be very much aware of the very fragile situation. And of course we see that Lukashenko would like to use daily basis NATO as a scapegoat. So I think we should keep in mind that do not harm, as they say among the medical doctors. That's the first rule. So I think we will monitor very closely the situation, definitely. Of course, we can help the process to be very clear on these issues that you just mentioned and Mr. Stoltenberg said in his statements. And of course, if the experts and if the colleagues have some additional thoughts, how can we support, but really support this situation, then of course we are very much ready and open for these ideas. So I think now I would like to follow these careful steps and nudging, not intervening into this process, but of course with the close monitoring of the situation. So again, thank you very much for all of our colleagues who engaged today with us in this conversation. And of course, I must repeat that we had excellent speakers. So thank you very much, Mark and Franak, to talk to us and share your thoughts and views. It was really, really impressive and interesting for us. So if Ruxandra doesn't have anything else to say, then I would like to close the today meeting and have a safe stay at home. Because now we are under again virus attack everywhere in Europe and in the NATO countries and the whole world. So keep safe and thank you very much for your kind presence and time. Thank you very much again. Goodbye. Bye.
Thank you.
Many thanks again to both of you.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Okay.